My name is Caleb Anderson, and for most of my life, my parents treated me like the family mistake. While my sister stacked Ivy League degrees and six-figure job offers, I spent my days teaching art to elementary school kids, glue on my hands, paint on my clothes, and zero respect at home. Last week, at my sister's graduation party, my parents made it official. In front of over 200 guests, they handed her the keys to a brand new Tesla Model Y and announced she'd just been gifted a $11 million Manhattan penthouse. My father called her the only success story this family ever produced. I stood in the back of the room like furniture, until a man in a charcoal suit walked up to me, slipped an envelope into my hand, and whispered, "Your grandfather always knew who you really were." And tonight, they're about to find out. What happened next didn't just shock my parents. Before we continue, like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have believed in you most. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let me tell you how one envelope changed everything. The ballroom itself felt like a monument to everything I was never meant to be. Crystal chandeliers hanging low like they were watching, white tablecloths without a single wrinkle, people dressed in confidence, and money moving in smooth practice circles. Every conversation about firms, partnerships, acquisitions, futures that sounded very far away from glue sticks and washable paint. My sister floated through it all like she belonged there by birthright, smiling that polished smile she'd perfected sometime around high school when praise became oxygen. My parents followed her closely, feeding the narrative, correcting anyone who undersold her achievements, amplifying every compliment like proud investors protecting their asset. I'd been placed strategically near the back, not officially, just socially. The way you are when no one thinks to introduce you, when your presence is tolerated but not highlighted. People asked me what I did and nodded politely before scanning the room. For someone more useful, my mother caught my eye once and gave me a tight smile that silently said, "Behave. Don't embarrass us. This night is important." Then my father took the microphone, cleared his throat, tapped the glass, and the room quieted instantly. He loved moments like this, moments where attention obeyed him. He talked about sacrifice, about excellence, about how proud he was to have raised someone who understood what it took to succeed. Then he held up the keys, and the applause came. Before the sentence even finished, the Tesla was symbolic more than anything, flashy proof that success deserved reward. But the penthouse announcement was the real punch. $11 million spoken so casually it felt unreal, like Monopoly money. People gasped, congratulated, toasted. Someone said she'd earned it. And my father laughed and said something about bloodlines and standards. And then he said it. That line that settled in my chest like wet cement, that not every child reaches their potential, but at least one of us had. The only success story this family ever produced. I watched people nod along, accepting it as fact. No one looked at me when he said it. No one needed to. I felt smaller than I had in years, like all the work I'd done, all the lives I'd touched, had been quietly erased by one sentence and a background noise. I was already planning my exit when the man appeared, charcoal suit, calm posture, eyes sharp in a way that didn't match the party. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself loudly, just said my name to confirm it was me, then pressed the envelope into my hand. It was heavier than expected, thick paper, sealed, not decorative, purposeful. When he leaned in and mentioned my grandfather, my heart stuttered. That name hadn't been spoken much since the funeral, mostly because he'd never fit the family narrative either. The man told me not to open it yet, that there was a right moment, that tonight would provide it. Then he disappeared, back into the crowd like he'd never been there. I stood frozen with the envelope burning in my palm. The noise of the party rushing back all at once. Laughter, clinking glasses, my sister thanking people near the stage, my mother dabbing her eyes dramatically. And for the first time all night, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like something was waiting, something patient and deliberate, something that had been set in motion long before this party was planned. I tucked the envelope into my jacket, heart pounding, and stayed exactly where I was, because whatever was inside it, I knew one thing for the first time in my life. This story wasn't over, and I wasn't just background anymore. After that moment, I stopped trying to disappear. I stayed where I was, leaning against a marble column near the back, watching everything with a clarity I'd never had before. My sister moved from group to group, soaking in admiration like sunlight. Her laugh sharp and confident, her posture perfect, every gesture rehearsed without her even realizing it. My parents hovered close, my mother adjusting her necklace whenever someone important approached, my father shaking hands like he was sealing deals instead of celebrating a child. Every few minutes, someone new congratulated them, not her, them, for raising such an extraordinary daughter. I noticed how often my father said we always knew she'd be special, as if destiny had personally signed her acceptance letters. No one mentioned hard work. No one mentioned help. And no one mentioned me at all. The envelope stayed tucked against my ribs, heavier with every passing minute. I could feel it when I breathed, like a second heart beating out of sync with the room. I didn't open it. Not yet. The man's voice echoed in my head. There's a right moment. Tonight will provide it. That kind of certainty doesn't come from guessing. It comes from knowing. I drifted toward the bar, ordered the cheapest drink on the menu out of habit even though everything was clearly covered, and listened. Conversations overlapped like radio stations. Someone talked about venture capital. Someone else about private schools. A woman in a silk dress complained about how hard it was to find a nanny who understood boundaries. When someone finally asked me what I did, I said I taught art. The pause came right on schedule. Oh, that's nice. Like a hobby you never outgrew. They smiled politely and turned away mid-sentence, already bored. I felt the old reflex to shrink, to apologize for existing in the wrong tax bracket, but it didn't land this time. I just nodded and watched them go. My sister climbed back onto the small stage near the DJ, tapping the microphone again. She wanted another moment. Of course she did. She thanked everyone for coming, thanked our parents for believing in her, thanked the city for opportunities, thanked her mentors, her professors, her future firm. She spoke well. She always did. Then she laughed and made a joke about how growing up not everyone in the family was academically inclined, but we all find our own paths. The crowd chuckled softly, the safe kind of laughter that knows who it's allowed to laugh at. I felt a few eyes flick in my direction and then quickly away, like looking too long might be contagious. My mother glanced at me then, her smile tight again, warning without words. Don't react. Don't ruin this. I realized something in that moment. They weren't afraid I'd embarrass them by being loud or angry. They were afraid I'd tell the truth. That was new. The man in the charcoal suit reappeared beside me as if summoned by the thought. He didn't look at the stage. He looked at me. Almost time, he said quietly. My mouth went dry. He asked if I trusted my grandfather. The question landed harder than I expected. I nodded. More than anyone. He said good. Because your grandfather trusted you more than anyone too. Then he gestured toward the stage, where my father was speaking again, talking about legacy now, about how the family business and properties would be consolidated under my sister's guidance, how the future was secure in capable hands. The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. That's the moment, he said. He guided me forward, not by grabbing my arm, just by stepping slightly ahead, so I followed without thinking. We stopped near the edge of the crowd. He leaned in once more and told me to open the envelope now. My fingers shook as I slid it open. Inside was a document, thick, formal, covered in legal language and stamps. I recognized my grandfather's name immediately. Below it, words that didn't make sense at first. Trust, executor, contingency, transfer. I scanned faster, heart racing, breath shallow. My name was there. Not once. Repeatedly. Assigned roles. Authority. Assets I didn't know existed. Conditions that read like instructions written by someone who knew exactly how this night would unfold. I looked up at the man, confused, overwhelmed. He introduced himself then. He was my grandfather's attorney. Had been for decades. He said my grandfather had planned this reveal very carefully. He knew the family dynamic. He knew who would be celebrated and who would be dismissed. He knew pressure would be applied publicly, because humiliation was the only language some people understood. The envelope wasn't a surprise. It was a safeguard. Before I could ask anything else, my father's voice boomed across the room again, announcing one final symbolic gesture. He wanted me up there. My name said aloud sounded strange in his mouth, like something unused. The room shifted. People turned. I felt every step as I moved forward, the weight of attention pressing down. My sister's smile faltered for half a second when she saw the attorney beside me. Just a flicker, but I caught it. I stood near the stage, envelope in hand, pulse pounding so hard I thought it might be audible. My father gestured for me to come closer, already framing the narrative. He spoke about family unity, about everyone knowing their strengths, about how some contributions are quieter but still appreciated. It sounded generous. It wasn't. He held out another document, this one thinner. A waiver. He said it casually, like a formality, just something to simplify things. He said I didn't need to worry about assets or responsibilities that didn't suit my lifestyle. That teaching was noble, but management was different. He said this was for my own good. I looked down at the paper. Then I looked at my grandfather's attorney, who said nothing, just nodded once. Permission without pressure. I raised my head, and for the first time didn't feel like the mistake in the room. I felt like the only person who knew how this story was actually written. And when I spoke, my voice didn't shake. I said I wasn't signing anything yet. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was stunned. My father laughed, sharp and quick, assuming I was joking. My mother stepped closer, whispering that this wasn't the time. My sister stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking another language. The attorney cleared his throat and asked, calmly, if he might address the room. My father tried to object. He used words like inappropriate and private. The attorney used words like binding and witnessed. And then, slowly, methodically, he began to explain exactly what my grandfather had left behind, who it belonged to, and under what conditions. Faces changed as the words sank in. Confusion turned into concern. Concern into disbelief. My sister's color drained. My mother sat down hard in the nearest chair. My father's jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. I stood there listening, the room spinning slightly, realizing that everything I'd been told about my worth had been a lie, carefully maintained because it benefited the people telling it. And for the first time, the balance shifted. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with truth, delivered at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. And that was only the beginning. The attorney didn't rush. That was the part that unnerved everyone most. He spoke slowly, clearly, like a teacher explaining something simple to people who'd chosen not to understand. He explained that my grandfather had created a private trust years before he passed, separate from what my parents believed they controlled. He explained that the trust had been designed specifically to activate under public coercion or attempted disinheritance. He used phrases like documented pressure and witnessed manipulation. Every word landed like a quiet hammer. The room stayed silent, not because people were polite, but because they were calculating what this meant for them and whether being present made them complicit. My father tried to interrupt, twice, each time louder than the last, insisting this was family business and that lawyers were always exaggerating. The attorney didn't raise his voice. He simply reminded my father that family business stops being private the moment it's used to publicly corner one member for compliance. He gestured around the room, hundreds of witnesses, phones already raised, the narrative slipping out of my parents' control faster than they could grab it back. My sister finally spoke, her voice tight, sharp, cutting through the tension. She said this was absurd. She said I had no experience, no background, no right. She said the trust must be outdated or manipulated. She looked at the attorney and demanded credentials, demanded proof, demanded authority. He provided all of it without hesitation. Dates, signatures, video notarizations, independent auditors. My grandfather had thought of everything. Even the challenge she was making right now had been anticipated. There was a clause for that, too. I watched my sister unravel in real time, not loudly, not dramatically, but internally, the way someone does when the ground they've been standing on turns out to be air. She wasn't angry yet. She was scared. She had built her entire identity on inevitability. Of course she'd inherit. Of course she'd lead. Of course the world would keep rewarding her because it always had. This wasn't just about money to her. It was about proof that she mattered more. My mother tried a different tactic. She reached for my hand, tears ready on command, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. She said this wasn't what my grandfather would have wanted. She said he loved harmony. She said I was hurting the family by allowing this to continue. I realized then how often harmony had meant silence when I was the one being diminished. Harmony meant compliance. Peace meant I swallowed it. The attorney gently removed my mother's hand from mine. He said William Anderson had left extensive notes about harmony. He believed harmony without honesty was just control in a softer tone. My mother went very still. Someone in the crowd asked a question out loud, Something about the penthouse, about the car, about whether those gifts were legitimate. The attorney answered honestly. The assets had been announced prematurely. They had not legally transferred. The keys were symbolic. The deed had never changed hands. A ripple moved through the room, part shock, part fascination. This was no longer a celebration. It was a live autopsy of entitlement. My father's voice broke when he asked me why I hadn't said anything sooner. The question was almost laughable. I told him the truth. Because no one ever asked. Because every time I tried to talk about my work, it was dismissed as cute. Because when people show you over and over that they don't want to hear your story, eventually you stop telling it. My voice stayed calm. That seemed to upset him more than anger would have. The attorney asked if I wished to speak. I hadn't planned to. But suddenly the room felt smaller, quieter, waiting. I said I didn't want anyone humiliated. I said that wasn't the point. I said my grandfather didn't build what he built to reward volume or prestige. He rewarded consistency, care, follow through. I said teaching art to kids wasn't settling. It was choosing impact over applause. Some people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Good. My sister laughed then, a short, brittle sound, and said impact doesn't pay for penthouses. I told her she was right. It pays for something else. She asked what? I said sleep. Meaning, being able to look at yourself without needing an audience to confirm you exist. The room went quiet again. The attorney announced that per the trust terms, management authority and decision power would temporarily transfer to me until a formal review could be conducted. Temporary sounded gentle, but everyone understood what it meant. The structure had already shifted. The people who'd assumed control was theirs by default were suddenly outsiders in their own narrative. My parents looked old then, not physically, but exposed, stripped of the certainty that had insulated them for decades. My father asked what I wanted to do now. The question hung heavy. I said I wanted to go home. I said tonight had been enough. The attorney nodded. He said the next steps would be handled privately, legally, properly. He handed my parents his card and told them not to contact me directly until counsel advised otherwise. As I walked away, people parted without being asked. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked at me with something close to respect, though it felt unfamiliar. My sister didn't follow. She stayed frozen near the stage, staring at the empty space where her certainty used to be. Outside, the night air felt unreal. Quiet. Clean. I sat on the steps for a moment. Envelope now empty, its contents alive in my mind. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't vindicated. I was steady. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove I belonged somewhere. I already did. And I knew, deep down, that what came next would be harder than tonight. Because power reveals character, and now everyone would have to show theirs. The next morning didn't feel like victory. It felt like waking up after a car accident when everything is quiet, but you know damage is still unfolding somewhere underneath. My phone had 23 missed calls before I even brushed my teeth, all from numbers I recognized, and a few I didn't. My parents, my sister too, and a cousin who'd never spoken to me unless she needed something, and 3 unknown numbers that I assumed were lawyers testing the waters. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the envelope again, like it might start talking if I waited long enough. By noon, the silence broke not with a call, but with a knock. A soft one, measured, polite, the kind of knock that assumes it will be welcomed. I knew before I opened the door who it would be. The same man from the night before, the charcoal suit replaced by a navy coat, his posture unchanged, calm, unreadable. He introduced himself properly, this time Richard Halvorson, executor trustee, and according to the papers, my grandfather's longest friend. He didn't step inside until I invited him. He noticed everything: the mismatched chairs, the paint stains on the floor, the stack of student drawings taped crookedly to the fridge. He smiled once, not indulgent, not impressed, just understanding. He told me my grandfather used to talk about this apartment more than the penthouse my parents lived in. Said this place mattered because it was real, because it was lived in, because it was honest. Richard laid out the situation carefully, no drama, no exaggeration. The trust was active, the transfer legal, airtight, but the pressure would intensify because people don't like losing things they thought were guaranteed, especially not in public. He said my family would try guilt first, then negotiation, then intimidation, not necessarily in that order. He asked me if I had support. I told him I had my students and a few friends, and that was enough. He nodded like that was the answer he'd expected. By afternoon, the email started. Not angry, not pleading, just strategic. Old family friends congratulating me while asking what my intentions were, people I'd never met suggesting coffee to discuss opportunities, advisors offering to help manage things I hadn't even decided to accept yet. I deleted most of them without responding. The noise wasn't useful. The clarity was. Then my sister showed up. No announcement, no call, just her standing in the hallway like she didn't know where to put her hands anymore. She looked smaller than the night before, stripped of the performance that polished the audience. She asked if she could come in. I said yes. She didn't sit right away, just stood there scanning the room like she was trying to understand how I could live here, how I could breathe without a view of the skyline. She said she hadn't slept. She said everyone was talking. She said our parents were furious, scared, embarrassed, all of it. She said the firm was asking questions. She said this wasn't how things were supposed to go. I asked her what she thought was supposed to happen. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice cracked just slightly. She said she thought the world was fair if you followed the rules, that if you worked harder, studied longer, sacrificed more, you earned more. She said she didn't understand how teaching kids to paint could outweigh what she'd done. I told her it wasn't a competition. That was the mistake. I told her my grandfather didn't measure worth by proximity to power. He measured it by what you did when no one was watching. She sat down, then finally, like her legs had given out. She asked me what I was going to do with everything. The money, the authority, the future my parents had assumed belonged to her. I told her I didn't know yet, but I knew what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to turn into them. I wasn't going to use it to punish or perform or prove anything. She asked if that meant I'd help her. I said help isn't the same as rescue. She nodded slowly like she understood, even if she didn't like it. That evening, my parents called together for the first time in years. Their voices were careful, measured, rehearsed. They said they were proud of me, said they'd always believed in me, said the party had gotten out of hand. I let them talk until the words ran out. Then I said something I'd never said before. I said I didn't need their approval anymore. I said if they wanted a relationship, it would have to be built on respect, not comparison, not control. There was a long silence. Then my father said he needed time. I told him time was fine, but distance was non-negotiable. Later, I walked to the window and watched the city settle into night. Somewhere downtown, contracts were being rewritten, alliances reconsidered, assumptions shattered. And here I was, still the same person with paint under my nails and lesson plans on the table. The difference was simple and terrifying. For the first time, no one could tell me I didn't matter. And that meant I had to decide what mattered next. By the end of that week, the story had leaked fully, not just whispers, but headlines, the kind that flatten nuance and sharpen sides overnight. I went from invisible to inconvenient to unavoidable, and my phone turned into a liability. Every notification carried weight, every silence felt deliberate. My parents stopped calling, but their lawyer didn't. He left a voicemail that sounded friendly on the surface, but carried threat underneath. Talking about mediation, about protecting the family legacy, about how public disputes never benefit anyone. I deleted it without replying because I was done negotiating my worth through intermediaries. The real pressure came quietly at first. Old friends from my parents' circle stopped responding to messages. Invitations I'd never asked for were suddenly rescinded. A donor pulled out of a small school program I supported, claiming optics concerns, which was a polite way of saying association with me now felt risky. It stung, but it also clarified something important. This wasn't about me as a person, it was about control, about who was allowed to rise without permission. I kept going to work every morning anyway, standing in front of kids who didn't care about headlines or money, who cared about whether today we were painting trees or learning how colors mix. Those hours grounded me. They reminded me why my grandfather chose me, even if I hadn't known it at the time. Midweek, Richard called again and asked if I was ready to see everything, the full scope, not just the numbers, but the intent, the plans my grandfather had sketched out over years. I said yes, and met him at a quiet office, not downtown, not flashy, just clean and functional like the man himself. We went through folders thick with notes, letters, diagrams, programs he'd wanted to fund, spaces he wanted to build. He hadn't just left money, he'd left instructions for stewardship. He believed power should amplify purpose, not replace it. He believed quiet work mattered more than loud success. He believed I would understand that instinctively. And sitting there reading his handwriting, I realized how long he'd been watching, waiting, trusting that I'd keep choosing the hard road, even when the easy one was offered. That night, my sister called again. This time, she didn't talk much. She asked questions, short ones, practical ones. She wanted to know what would happen to the penthouse, the car, the promises made in front of those guests. I told her the truth. Some things would unwind, some would stay, some consequences couldn't be avoided. She asked if there was any way forward that didn't involve her starting from scratch. I told her yes, but it would look nothing like what she'd planned. She went quiet, then said something that surprised me. She said she didn't know who she was without being the best, without winning, without being praised. I told her that wasn't her fault entirely, but it was her responsibility. Now she didn't argue, she just said she needed time. The next morning, I stood in front of my class holding a painting one of my students had made a mess of color and shape that somehow still felt intentional. I told them art doesn't have to make sense to be meaningful. Sometimes it just has to be honest. I realized then that this was the line my family had never crossed. They wanted sense, status, structure. They never understood meaning. And now, whether they liked it or not, that difference was shaping everything that came next. The week after everything cracked open felt like walking through a city after an earthquake, where the buildings were still standing, but everyone knew some of them were about to fall. I kept my routine on purpose, same alarm, same coffee, same walk to the subway, because routine was the only thing that felt solid anymore. At school, nothing had changed on the surface. The kids still ran into the room, yelling my name, still argued about crayons, still hugged my legs like I was a piece of furniture that belonged to them. And in a strange way, that was the safest place I could be, because none of them expected me to be anything other than exactly who I already was. Outside that classroom, everything was shifting fast. The board my grandfather had set up started moving quietly. People I had never met requesting meetings, not to challenge me, but to understand me, which was new and unsettling. Richard warned me that curiosity was the polite cousin of fear, and that some of these people were trying to decide whether to oppose me or attach themselves to me. I declined most meetings, but agreed to a few on neutral ground, small conference rooms, no glass walls, no assistants taking notes. I wanted to see how people behaved when there was nothing to perform for. My parents stayed silent publicly, which I knew was strategic. They were waiting for an opening, waiting for me to stumble or overreact. Privately, my mother sent a message that said only we should talk face to face. No lawyers, no press, just family. I didn't respond right away because for once I was allowed to take my time. The power shift wasn't about money, it was about pace. For the first time, they couldn't rush me into anything. My sister, on the other hand, unraveled faster than I expected. Her firm placed her on leave pending review, not because she'd done anything illegal, but because controversy makes institutions nervous, and she had become radioactive overnight. She texted me long messages, then deleted them, then sent short ones like, "Are you okay? Or can we talk later?" I answered only when I had the energy. I wasn't punishing her, but I wasn't rescuing her either. That was a line I'd learned to hold. Midweek, Richard showed me something my grandfather had never mentioned: letters he'd written to my parents that were never sent, drafts of conversations he'd hoped to have, but didn't trust would land. In them, he wasn't angry, just disappointed, which somehow hurt more. He wrote about watching my parents confuse achievement with value, about seeing them reward performance and overlook compassion. He wrote that he loved both his grandchildren, but worried one had been taught to chase applause while the other had learned to work in silence. He wrote that silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. That night, I finally agreed to meet my parents at their place, not the penthouse, not a restaurant, just their house, the one filled with expensive art and quiet corners. Walking in felt surreal, like stepping back into a role I'd been playing my whole life, except this time I wasn't auditioning. My mother hugged me too tightly. My father stood stiff, like he was afraid to say the wrong thing. We sat at the table where every childhood conversation had been a comparison chart. They started with apologies, but they were clumsy, mixed with justifications and explanations about pressure and expectations and how they thought they were motivating me. I let them talk until they ran out of words. Then I told them how it felt growing up in a house where love seemed conditional, where praise was earned and silence was the default response to anything that didn't fit the narrative. I told them I stopped trying to impress them years ago, not because I didn't care, but because caring hurt too much. My father looked at his hands the whole time. My mother cried quietly. They asked what I wanted. I said honesty. I said boundaries. I said no more public displays that erased me or elevated my sister at my expense. I said if we were going to rebuild anything, it would be slow and uncomfortable and very real. They agreed too quickly, which made me suspicious, but I could see the fear underneath, not fear of losing money, but fear of losing the story they'd told themselves about who they were as parents. After I left, I walked for hours, letting the city absorb the weight of the conversation. Somewhere along that walk, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired but clear. And clarity is dangerous to people who rely on confusion to maintain control. The next morning, my sister showed up at my classroom during prep period, standing in the doorway like she didn't know if she was allowed to enter this version of my life. I stepped into the hall with her, and she surprised me by apologizing without excuses, no comparisons, no tears, just a quiet acknowledgement that she'd benefited from a system that hurt me. She said she didn't know how to exist without being the best, and that scared her. I told her fear was a start. We talked about what came next, not in terms of inheritance or reputation, but in terms of identity. For the first time, it felt like a conversation, not a competition. By the end of that day, the news cycle had moved on to the next scandal, but the aftershocks were still rippling through my family, through institutions, through rooms I wasn't in. And standing alone in my classroom, surrounded by half-finished paintings and the smell of tempera paint, I understood something my grandfather had known all along. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when it finally moves, it does so quietly, reshaping everything without asking permission. The following days felt slower but heavier, like the moment after a storm when everything looks calm, but you know cleanup hasn't even started yet. I started getting recognized in places I'd never been noticed before, not celebrity style, just the subtle shift in how people looked at me, longer questions asked more carefully, assumptions revised in real time. It was unsettling because I hadn't changed at all, but the world around me had adjusted its posture, and I was learning how much of respect is conditional on perceived power. At school, the administration pulled me aside not to congratulate me, but to ask if I needed security, which made me laugh out loud for the first time in days. I told them the only thing I needed was more storage space for art supplies. They smiled politely, unsure if I was joking. I wasn't. The kids were the same, blissfully unaware of family drama and legal trusts and social implosions. One of them handed me a drawing that day, a crooked house with stick figures labeled Mom, Dad, and Teacher in the middle, bigger than the rest. I taped it to my desk and felt something settle in my chest. Richard kept me updated without overwhelming me, which I appreciated. He told me a few of my parents' longtime associates had quietly distanced themselves, not out of loyalty to me, but out of fear of being on the wrong side of a shift. He also told me some people were watching closely, not to exploit, but to learn. He said my grandfather always believed influence didn't have to be loud to be lasting. He believed that the way you move when no one is watching is the only thing that actually counts. My sister called late one night, voice small, not frantic, just tired. She said she'd gone to the penthouse alone, walked through the rooms, and realized none of it felt like hers, not the view, not the silence, not the expensive furniture arranged for effect rather than comfort. She said she'd sat on the floor and cried because she didn't know what she wanted if no one was watching. I didn't try to fix it. I just listened. That felt like the most honest thing either of us had done in years. My parents invited me to dinner again, not an event, not a celebration, just dinner. I hesitated but agreed on the condition that there would be no speeches, no apologies, no rehashing the past like a courtroom transcript. Just food and conversation. It was awkward at first, filled with pauses and safe topics, but something shifted when my father asked about my students and actually listened to the answer. My mother asked if I was tired and meant it. Small things but real. That night I went home and opened a folder Richard had given me earlier, labeled personal. Inside were notes my grandfather had written, not about money or plans, but about me, observations from afar, moments he'd noticed and admired. He wrote about seeing me help a stranger with a flat tire and not telling anyone about it. About watching me give my coat to someone outside a grocery store in winter. About choosing teaching not because it was easy, but because it mattered. He wrote that the world would always reward noise, but that silence was where real work happened. I sat there for a long time, letting that sink in. For most of my life, I'd believed being overlooked meant being unimportant. Now I understood it meant being free. Free to choose values without performance, free to build something without asking permission, free to exist without comparison. By the end of the week, I realized the envelope hadn't changed me. It had revealed me. And that scared the people who had benefited from me staying small. The hardest part wasn't stepping into what came next. It was letting go of the version of myself that thought I needed to earn space in rooms I'd already outgrown. By the time the second week rolled around, I started to understand that power doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through small moments, through the way conversations change, through the pauses people take before answering you, through the sudden politeness where there used to be dismissal. I didn't enjoy it, but I paid attention because ignoring reality had never helped me before. Richard asked if I was ready to sit in on my first formal meeting connected to the trust, not a boardroom full of suits, just a planning session with two advisors my grandfather had personally vetted years ago. I agreed on one condition: no theatrics, no ego games, no rushing me. They respected that immediately, which told me everything I needed to know. People who actually understand responsibility don't try to overwhelm you, they try to equip you. They walked me through the structure slowly, explaining why my grandfather had separated assets from influence, why he'd layered oversight into the system instead of concentrating authority in one place. He'd built it like he built relationships, with patience and redundancy, so no one could hijack it for their own image. They showed me projected outcomes if nothing changed and alternatives if I chose to redirect funds toward education, community programs, and long-term sustainability. The numbers were big, but the decisions were human, and that made them manageable. That afternoon, I went back to my classroom and taught like nothing had happened, because that was the point. One of my students asked why adults make things complicated when kids know what's fair. I told her sometimes grown-ups forget how to listen. She nodded like that made sense and went back to mixing blue and yellow into green. My sister asked if she could shadow me for a day, not to make amends, not to prove anything, just to see what my life actually looked like. I hesitated, but said yes on one condition: she didn't introduce herself, she just observed. She wore simple clothes, no makeup, no phone in hand. I watched her struggle with the noise, the unpredictability, the emotional intensity of kids who don't regulate the way adults expect them to. I watched her kneel on the floor to help a child clean spilled paint and freeze when the kid hugged her unexpectedly, like she wasn't used to affection that didn't come with expectation. At lunch, she admitted she'd never been in a space where success wasn't measured immediately, where progress couldn't be quantified by titles or salaries. She said it scared her, but also felt strangely grounding. I didn't comment. I let the experience do the work. Meanwhile, my parents were navigating their own fallout quietly. Invitations stopped coming. A few longtime acquaintances went cold. Others reached out privately to say they admired my grandfather, but hadn't realized the dynamic in our family. I didn't engage. This wasn't about repairing their reputation. It was about resetting boundaries. One evening, Richard brought over a final set of documents, not urgent, not dramatic, just closure items. At the bottom of the folder was a letter from my grandfather marked last instruction. In it, he wrote that inheritance isn't about possession, it's about continuity. He said he trusted me not because I was flawless, but because I was consistent. He said I understood that the work continues whether or not someone is watching. That was the legacy he cared about, not the buildings, not the accounts, but the direction. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No rehearsed conversations, no imaginary arguments, just rest. When I woke up, I knew what came next, not in detail, but in principle. I wasn't going to disappear into the background again, but I also wasn't going to step into the spotlight just because it was available. I would move deliberately, slowly, choosing alignment over applause. The envelope had done its job. It didn't elevate me above my family, it leveled the field. And for the first time, we were all standing on ground that required honesty to stay upright. The third week was when the real resistance showed up, not loud, not dramatic, but sharp and calculated, the kind of resistance that smiles while it looks for leverage. My parents' circle had fully split. By then, some people quietly stepping back, others trying to reposition themselves near me, as if proximity alone could grant safety. I learned quickly who had seen me as a person all along, and who only saw me now because circumstances forced them to update their assessment. It started with an anonymous email sent to my school board questioning whether someone with sudden financial influence should be teaching children, citing conflict of interest concerns framed in language that sounded official enough to trigger protocol. The administration handled it calmly, but it was a reminder that power doesn't like to be challenged quietly. It prefers compliance or spectacle, and when it gets neither, it probes for weakness. I wasn't angry, just alert. This was the part my grandfather had prepared me for without ever saying it out loud. Richard confirmed my suspicion. The message hadn't come from nowhere. Someone close to my parents had floated the idea, hoping it would scare me into stepping back into my assigned role, the quiet one, the harmless one. Instead, it clarified my path. I met with the board, transparently laid out everything, answered questions without defensiveness, and when they asked if I planned to leave teaching, I said no, without hesitation. That answer seemed to surprise them more than any financial disclosure could have. The matter closed quickly, but the message had been sent both ways. My sister called that night shaken. She'd heard about the email and immediately assumed it was meant to punish her through me. For the first time, she sounded protective instead of defensive. She asked if she should say something publicly, deny involvement, clarify her position. I told her no. Silence wasn't avoidance anymore, it was strategy. We weren't going to react to every provocation. We were going to choose where our energy went. She told me she'd started seeing a therapist not because anyone told her to, but because she didn't recognize herself anymore. Without the constant reinforcement of praise, she felt unmoored. She said she was learning how much of her identity had been built around being impressive rather than being present. I listened and realized how different this conversation was from anything we'd ever had. There was no scoreboard, no comparison, just two people trying to figure out who they were without the noise. Meanwhile, my parents finally requested another meeting, this time with Richard present, which told me they'd accepted that the old power dynamics were gone. The conversation was uncomfortable but necessary. They wanted to know what the future looked like, what their role would be, where they stood. I told them plainly that nothing would go back to how it was. That their relationship with me would depend on consistency, not statements. That their relationship with my sister would require them to let go of the narrative that she had to be exceptional to be loved. They didn't argue. That silence felt heavier than any protest. In the days that followed, I started receiving letters, not emails, not messages, but handwritten notes from people I'd never met, teachers, parents, community organizers, thanking me not for money, not for influence, but for staying visible. One woman wrote that seeing someone like me hold ground without changing who they were made her feel less alone. I didn't respond publicly to any of it, but I kept every letter in a box because I knew on harder days I'd need to remember why I was doing this. Richard invited me to visit one of the properties my grandfather had earmarked for future use, not as an asset, but as a space. It was an old building, nothing glamorous, but solid, with good light and room to grow. Standing there, I could already imagine classrooms, studios, places where kids could make messes and meaning at the same time. It felt right in a way the penthouse never could. That was when I understood that this wasn't about reclaiming what had been denied to me. It was about redirecting it. My sister joined me later that week, unannounced, carrying coffee like an offering. She walked through the space, slowly touching the walls, asking questions about what could be built here. She said she didn't want to be handed anything anymore. She wanted to earn her place by contributing, not outperforming. I told her contribution isn't measured by suffering, but by sincerity. She nodded like that was a language she was just learning to speak. That weekend, my parents came by the space too. It was awkward at first, but when my father started talking about logistics, not dominance, just problem solving, I saw a glimpse of the man my grandfather had hoped he'd become. My mother asked how she could help. Not lead, not direct, just help. I gave her small tasks, nothing symbolic, nothing grand, and she did them quietly without complaint. That mattered more than any apology. The resistance didn't disappear, but it lost its edge. When people realized I wasn't reacting, I wasn't retreating, and I wasn't performing, they moved on to easier targets. Power without spectacle isn't interesting to those who thrive on chaos. One night, alone in my apartment, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes of supplies and plans, I thought about the years I'd spent believing invisibility was a flaw. I realized now it had been armor. It had allowed me to develop values without interference, to choose a life without needing validation. The envelope hadn't changed my trajectory, it had simply removed the weight that had been pressing me into the ground. The truth was uncomfortable for everyone involved, including me. But discomfort was temporary. Integrity wasn't. And as the noise faded and the work began, I finally understood what my grandfather had meant when he said silence was preparation. I hadn't been waiting to be seen. I'd been getting ready to act. By the time the dust settled publicly, the quiet work had already begun privately, and that's where things got heavier, not louder, just heavier, in a way that presses on your chest when you finally stop running. I stopped being a headline and became a responsibility again, and that was exactly what I wanted. The trust documents finalized the following week, and with them came decisions that couldn't be symbolic. They had to be practical and ethical, because once money starts moving, intent gets tested fast. I kept teaching every morning, same classroom, same kids, same chip tables, and drying paint racks, and that consistency anchored me while everything else shifted around it. The first real test came from people who meant well but didn't listen. Advisors, consultants, distant relatives, all suggesting I should scale or leverage visibility or step into a leadership role full-time, as if teaching was a placeholder until something bigger arrived. I learned quickly that power attracts projection. Everyone sees in it what they want it to be, not what it is. I said no more times in 1 month than I had in my entire adult life, and each no clarified something for me. I wasn't here to become impressive, I was here to become useful. The space we'd visited earlier was approved for renovation quietly, without a press release, without donor names on the walls, just permits and plans. I worked with a small team of educators and therapists, not executives, to design it from the inside out, because buildings don't change, people, programs do. We planned rooms that could get messy, loud, unpredictable, and safe all at once, because that's what real learning looks like. Every decision went through the same question: would this help a child who struggles to communicate feel seen, without pressure? If the answer wasn't a clear yes, it didn't make the cut. My sister showed up more often than I expected, not hovering, not trying to reclaim relevance, just learning. She asked questions she didn't know the answers to, and didn't pretend otherwise. One afternoon, she sat in on a class, watched a kid spend 40 minutes painting the same shape over and over until suddenly something clicked, and the kid smiled like they'd cracked a code. She cried quietly in the corner, and later told me she'd never seen patience modeled that way before. She said law school taught her how to win arguments, but not how to witness growth. Our parents hovered at a distance, at first uncertain where they fit when they weren't directing the narrative. It took time for them to understand that presence didn't mean control, and eventually they settled into something resembling humility. My father started volunteering with logistics, not leadership, just moving things where they needed to go. My mother worked with supplies, labeling, organizing, asking before acting. It wasn't perfect, but it was different, and different was enough for now. There were moments when resentment bubbled up unexpectedly, not explosive, just sharp, like a memory triggered by something small, a tone, a phrase, a look. I didn't suppress it, I acknowledged it and let it pass, because healing isn't pretending nothing happened, it's refusing to let the past dictate the future. Therapy helped not because it erased what I'd been through, but because it gave me language for it, and language is power when silence has been your default. The opening of the center came, without fanfare, just families, teachers, and kids walking into a space that smelled like fresh paint and hope. No speeches, no donors, no ribbon cutting, just doors opening. Watching kids explore that space was the moment everything locked into place for me. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't vindication, this was alignment. My grandfather hadn't handed me an answer, he'd handed me permission. Media attention flared briefly when someone leaked the story again, trying to frame it as a fall from grace or a reversal of fortune. I declined interviews not out of fear, but out of focus. The work didn't need commentary, it needed consistency. Attention fades, impact doesn't. I watched as interest moved on to louder stories and felt relieved. One evening after a long day, I found myself alone in the center, sitting on the floor surrounded by unfinished art projects and half-clean brushes, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: ease. Not joy exactly, not triumph, just peace. The kind that comes when your actions line up with your values and nothing is being performed for approval. I thought about the envelope again, not the paper, but the moment it represented, the pivot between being defined and defining yourself. It wasn't a gift, it was a mirror. It showed me who I was when no one was watching and who I could be when everyone finally was. There were still consequences. Relationships that never fully recovered, people who never apologized and likely never would. I made peace with that too, because closure doesn't always come with resolution, sometimes it comes with release. I didn't need everyone to understand my choices, I needed to stand by them. As the months went on, the work expanded organically because people trusted it, not because it was advertised. Teachers from other districts asked for guidance, parents shared stories, administrators listened because results spoke louder than credentials. I stayed in the classroom because that's where I learned what mattered, and every decision traced back to those kids, those moments, those quiet breakthroughs that never made headlines but changed lives. If there was one thing I learned through all of this, it was that being underestimated is a strange kind of freedom. When expectations are low, you get room to build something honest without interference. And when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand. I wasn't the family mistake. I was the family's course correction, and I didn't need to prove it anymore. The strange thing was how normal everything became once the chaos stopped chasing us. There was no victory lap, no moment where life suddenly felt cinematic again. It was quieter than that, slower, heavier in a grounded way. I'd wake up before sunrise, pack my bag with lesson plans and paint jars, and drive the same route to school past the same bodega and cracked sidewalks. The kids didn't know or care about envelopes or inheritances or family implosions. They cared that the red paint was empty and that someone remembered they liked sharks or space or purple more than blue. That grounded me more than anything else ever had. Word still traveled, though just not loudly. People in education circles started reaching out not because of the money, but because of the model. They wanted to know how the program worked, why it didn't feel extractive, why it centered kids instead of donors. I told them the truth every time. It worked because it was designed by listening, not branding. It worked because no one was trying to win anything. You'd be surprised how rare that is. My sister kept showing up quietly, sometimes just sitting, sometimes helping, sometimes asking questions that weren't about optics, but about impact. One afternoon, she asked me something I didn't expect. She said, "How do you live with knowing you were right all along and no one believed you?" I told her the truth again. I don't live with that feeling. I live with the work. Being right isn't satisfying. Being useful is. She nodded like that answer hurt, but also relieved her of something she'd been carrying for years. Our parents struggled more. Not outwardly dramatic, just internally disoriented. Their social circle shifted invitations, slowed conversations, changed tone. When your identity is built on proximity to prestige, losing that proximity feels like losing oxygen. But instead of scrambling, they sat with it. My father admitted one night that he didn't know how to talk to people if he wasn't impressive. That was the first honest thing he'd said to me in decades. I didn't comfort him. I didn't scold him. I just listened. Sometimes that's the hardest work of all. The foundation work deepened, not expanded. We turned down funding opportunities that came with conditions that didn't align. We paid staff fairly even when it meant growing slower. We measured success in retention, not headlines. And slowly the culture we wanted became the culture we had. People stayed because they felt respected, not because it looked good on paper. I found one of my grandfather's old notebooks tucked into a box we hadn't opened yet. It wasn't about money or planning. It was sketches mostly and notes about people he'd met, students he'd taught, ideas he never pursued because life moved faster than intention. On the inside cover, he'd written one sentence: "Build what won't embarrass you when no one is watching." I sat with that for a long time. There were still moments of doubt, especially late at night, when exhaustion made everything feel heavier. I wondered if I should have done more earlier, spoken up sooner, defended myself louder. Then a kid would hand me a drawing, or a parent would send a message saying their child finally felt safe somewhere, and the doubt would dissolve. Regret doesn't survive usefulness. I realized something else too. The envelope didn't just change my family. It changed the story I told myself. For years, I'd internalized the idea that choosing a quieter path meant accepting smaller impact. I was wrong. Quiet paths don't mean small ones. They just don't advertise themselves. What came next wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. Decisions about long-term governance, succession, transparency, things that don't trend but determine whether something lasts. I insisted on structures that outlived me because this wasn't about legacy in the narcissistic sense. It was about continuity. If I disappeared tomorrow, the work should still stand. I stopped checking for validation altogether. No more searching rooms for approval, no more measuring myself against someone else's milestones. Comparison had been the poison. Purpose was the antidote. And just when it felt like things had settled fully, something unexpected arrived, not as a threat, but as a question. An opportunity that forced me to choose again between visibility and integrity. And this time the stakes weren't about family or money. They were about whether I'd protect what we built or trade it for something louder. That decision would come soon. And it would say everything about who I really was now. The real ending didn't happen in a ballroom or a courtroom or on a stage. It happened months later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when I unlocked my classroom and realized something fundamental had shifted, not around me, but inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing myself for judgment. I wasn't waiting for comparison. I wasn't measuring my worth against anyone else's scoreboard. I was just present, and that presence felt heavier and more powerful than all the applause I'd never received before. The foundation was running smoothly, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. Every dollar traceable, every program built from actual need, not optics. Teachers stopped me in hallways, parents sent letters, kids drew pictures of what safety looked like to them. And somehow that mattered more than any headline ever could. My sister changed in ways I didn't expect, not overnight, not perfectly, but genuinely. She learned how exhausting it is to care without getting credit, how slow real impact is how humbling it feels when no one is impressed by you and how addictive that humility can become once it settles in. One night, she told me quietly that for the first time in her life, she slept without rehearsing who she needed to be the next day, and I knew then that the inheritance didn't save her, the work did. My parents kept unraveling their old beliefs too, piece by piece, learning that success without connection is just loneliness with better furniture, learning that pride is expensive and love is not, learning that the child they overlooked had been carrying the family's values the whole time without ever being asked to. They apologized more than once, not in grand speeches, but in changed behavior and listening instead of correcting, and asking questions instead of giving advice, and that was enough. I stopped waiting for closure and realized I was already living it. The envelope eventually went into a box with student drawings and thank you notes, not as a symbol of revenge, but as proof that truth doesn't need urgency, it only needs patience. My grandfather never rushed justice because he understood timing better than anyone. He knew that character reveals itself eventually if you give it room, and he trusted me to do something meaningful with what he left behind, not just financially, but philosophically. The biggest surprise of all was how ordinary happiness became once I stopped chasing validation. Mornings were quieter, nights were lighter, my work felt rooted instead of reactive, and I learned that peace isn't something you earn after proving yourself, it's something that shows up when you stop trying to prove anything at all. If there's one thing I hope sticks with anyone hearing this, it's this: you don't need a dramatic ending to justify a meaningful life. You don't need witnesses for your integrity. You don't need permission to choose purpose over performance. The world will always crown the loudest success first, but time always sides with the ones who build something real. I was never the family mistake, I was just ahead of my time. And so are you if you're still standing quietly doing the work that no one claps for yet. That's not the end of the story, that's the foundation of it. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below, and don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.